Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ben Hunt. I'm the Head of Corporate Affairs at Siemens Gamesa. I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar, Unlocking European Energy Security. Before I introduce today's speakers, I'd just like to take a couple of minutes to set the context of today's discussion, our second in a series on green hydrogen. About a year ago, talking about green hydrogen in the context of decarbonisation was the subject of our webinar. And while the decarbonisation challenge has clearly not gone away, a new motivation for developing green hydrogen arrived earlier this year, and the public discourse pivoted almost immediately. The global crisis resulting from Russia's invasion of Ukraine has challenged governments across the world in many ways, dealing with a humanitarian tragedy, food price hikes, the cost of living crisis, and also, and this is the reason why we are here today, how best to secure energy independence, especially in Europe, and wean our economies off imported oil and gas. Europe's dependence on imported fossil fuels from Russia has exposed a major weakness in our economy. Unless urgent action is taken, continued volatility and supply issues will further weaken the economy and jeopardize net zero commitments made at COP26 in Glasgow last year. The EU's Repower EU initiative aims to make Europe independent from Russian fossil fuels before 2030. And while some progress was made at the recent summit in Brussels, not everybody felt it went far enough, only banning oil and gas imported by sea this year. The facts are stark. Progress on the energy transition is too slow, frighteningly so. In 2021, only 11 gigawatts of new wind farms were built in the European Union. We need 32 gigawatts a year, every year, just to meet 2030 targets. And that increases to 40 gigawatts per year with the new Repower EU targets. Every year that we fall behind, the summit gets steeper and that much harder to reach. So to reach net zero by 2050, we cannot do it by electrification alone. Sectors such as heavy transportation, industry and manufacturing need clean fuels to decarbonize. To produce green hydrogen, we need more wind. And if we are to support industries such as chemicals, cement, fertilizers, iron and steel, it has to be done quick. So we need to accelerate the deployment of wind and other renewables, and we need to scale the production of green hydrogen if we are to reach net zero and halt the worst effects of climate change. But if that isn't enough, the immediate energy security crisis is a critical incentive to act, and act quickly. Climate change and the energy security crisis present a dual threat to our societies, economies, and communities. The question that we have in front of us today is, what can we do about it? So I'll now introduce the agenda and our speakers and panelists. First, we're going to have an introductory speech from Gauri Singh, who is the Deputy Director General of IRENA. Ms. Singh brings more than 30 years of experience in policy, advocacy and project implementation within the field of renewable energy and sustainable development from India, as well as the international system. We'll then move on to a panel discussion, and there will be an opportunity for everybody who's on the webinar this afternoon to ask questions in the panel discussion. You just need to use the box in your browser, which is below the screen. And the panel discussion, we have some excellent speakers to help us understand this subject better. First is Paulo Frankel, the head of the Renewable Energy Division at the IEA. Paulo leads the IEA's work on renewables, providing analysis and advice on policies, markets and technologies. He has 30 years of experience on renewable energy systems and markets, life cycle assessment and eco-labeling. Jim Watson is Professor of Energy Policy and Director of the UCL Institute for Sustainable Resources and Research Director of the FCDO Climate Compatible Growth Programme. He has 20 years of research experience on climate change, energy and innovation policy. Ruud Kempener is Acting Deputy Head of Unit of Renewables and the Energy System Integration Policy of the DG for Energy at the European Commission. He coordinates the Commission's strategies on hydrogen and energy system integration and leads a team that works on EU hydrogen policies, renewables financing and international cooperation activities on renewables. And Carlos Navas has been in the hydrogen field for over 28 years in various positions in the public-private sectors. He joined Energas in April 2020 as Senior Management of Hydrogen Projects, and he works on where he works with industry and public administration representatives to explore collaboration and renewables financing. Energas is the main gas transmission system operator in Spain and operates close to 12,000 kilometers of pipelines and 6 liquid natural gas terminals. The company is committed to the energy transition towards a decarbonised system and has been working on renewable gas projects for a number of years. To channel these efforts, Energas Renovable, a subsidiary which Carlos works in, was set up to promote renewable gas projects and has a portfolio of over 30 projects to date. Following our panel discussion, we will then ask our CEO of our service business unit from Siemens Gamesa, Juan Gutierrez, to bring proceedings to a close. He has a mere 17 years of experience in the energy industry and has broad global expertise across many areas, including product marketing and lifecycle management, sales operations, business development, and strategy. Welcome and thank you all for joining us today. And so without any further ado, I would like to turn the meeting over to Gauri Singh from IRENA. Gauri, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ben, and it's a pleasure to be here today to talk a little bit about IRENA's work and share our perspectives on what we think is the role of green hydrogen moving ahead. As you have very clearly enunciated, that green hydrogen will obviously have a very important role, not just as an energy carrier, but also in the decarbonization of some of these hard to abate sectors like the industrial sectors you just spoke about. But it's also a very large opportunity to increase the national energy security and move away from the dependence on fossil fuels and energy imports. So as all of us are aware, there's this growing recognition, and we've seen the political momentum that's been built up around the need to accelerate action for a climate safe future. And the IRENA's flagship report, the World Energy Transition Outlook, in fact, makes it very clear that we must focus on the immediately deployable solutions of today if we are to have a fighting chance to stay on the 1.5 degree pathway. And IRENA does believe that most of the solutions will come from renewables, with energy efficiency also playing an important role. So it's in terms of green hydrogen, I just want to add that this is also a fuel that's not, it's not extracted. It's in fact, because it's a manufacturing process. So it has the, it cannot get cartelized or weaponized in the same way, because any place that we have renewables at competitive prices and the availability of water, that's where green hydrogen can get manufactured. And which is why it becomes a very important aspect of the national and regional energy independence discussion. We did also have a recent report that we released with our partners, World Bank and the UN statistics and the IEA, on how the SDG 7 is moving. And what we do find in that is that renewable energy was one of the energy sources that grew even in the pandemic in terms of both deployment and the investments that went into it. So it is in our assessment, we think that hydrogen and its derivatives will form almost about 12% of the total final energy consumption. And right now it accounts for only about 2.5, which in a sense gives you the challenge that we face in terms of ramping it up for achieving our climate goals. And I think all governments need to prioritize hydrogen and to prioritize it in sectors where it's really needed. In that sense, we are also very proud of our collaboration with Siemens Gamesa on some of the technological advancements for hydrogen. If you could move to the next slide, please. So yes, I think it's there now. So in terms of what this chart shows is that um, mostly we do know that green hydrogen will play a role in substituting fossil fuels in industry, heavy industry, and transportation, long distance transportation, including aviation and shipping. But these are the priority areas for where green hydrogen is obviously going to be in demand is those areas which cannot be electrified, those end users that cannot be electrified. And in addition, we also know that there is a huge potential that it has in terms of being able to contribute to the flexibility of the power system and to facilitate the integration of even more renewables in our grid. So if I could just move to the next slide, please. So I want to spend a couple of minutes just talking about what we see as how the trade in green hydrogen will develop. And we recently released a report on the geopolitics of energy transformation, and it's called the Hydrogen Factor, where it was emphasized that much like how the movement of oil and gas happens, the hydrogen is also going to be one of very important trade constituents. And we expect that about 1/4 of the hydrogen produced will be traded across borders, with the rest of it being consumed, produced and consumed domestically and regionally. So it does allow countries to utilize their renewable energy resources and reduce dependency on imported energy. And we also have assessed that about half of the traded amount is likely to be delivered by ships and pipelines. And we expect that the transportation on ships will be very much in the form of hydrogen derivatives like liquid ammonia. So this, in fact, opens the door for a future liquid market, very similar to the liquefied natural gas trading, international trading. And some say that ammonia will be the new LNG. So, but all the same, it's very important to have a solid certification scheme in place that tracks the carbon footprint of hydrogen that's being traded, so as to allow for a correct carbon emission counting at the end user. And IRENA is working along with the G7 countries to contribute to getting this certification out. If you could just move to the final slide, please. So at the end, I just want to say that reaching the Paris targets is going to be clearly one of the biggest challenges that we have encountered, and developing enough green hydrogen is also a part of this huge challenge that we have before us. What we do have right now in terms of electrolyzers is just about 0.5 gigawatt, and we need to move from this 0.5 gigawatt globally today to about 5,000 gigawatts by 2050. And in fact, in the next 2 years, we're really looking for an investment of about 16 gigawatts to come online. Ammonia clearly will also will move to become one of the dominant fuel for shipping, and sustainable aviation fuels also need to get ramped up. And all this needs to happen in a time window, a very short time window of 30 years. So I think it's, to be able to reach these targets of energy transition and climate goals that we've set for ourselves, and to ensure energy security, and to be able to deliver hydrogen in a reliable way to the hard to decarbonize sectors, I think it's very important to have a collaborative and an integrative approach across all areas, going right from technology to policy to getting the finance mobilized. And it's only then that we can, we can hope to see our journey towards net zero becoming successful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I think you've articulated the challenges and the opportunities very well for us, and set up the panel discussion extremely well. So we'll move straight on to that now. I'm going to direct my first question to Professor Watson. Energy security matters to Europe now more than ever, and in February and March of this year, I think we all had a little bit of a crash course in where our energy comes from. And how accessible and expensive it can become if the systems are not working smoothly. So how can we secure greater energy independence than previously, and how quickly can we do that?
Yeah, thank you. I think the first thing I'd say is energy security isn't the same thing as energy independence. I think, you can be secure while still being interdependent with other countries. And I think actually one of Gauri's slides really illustrates that. So the future where hydrogen is more important might still involve a lot of energy trade. And that might mean sometimes that the price of hydrogen is high because there's a shock of some sort. So I'd say that, it's more about thinking about the resilience of your energy system and things like the diversity of the sources of the energy you're getting. And of course, we want to move away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible. So to do things quickly, the EU, the UK, many other countries have set out, the main principles of what to do. And I think they're all moving along the right lines in different ways. But, thinking about what you could do fast, such as the energy efficiency, in particular, diversifying sources of things like oil and gas as much as possible. That's in the EU plan, the UK plan, the US plan. And then, laying the plans for things that are going to come on stream more slowly, the infrastructure projects, whether it be renewable, hydrogen, etc. So, there's a lot we can do, but I think it's really important to just think about, as we move through that transition, maintaining the resilience or strengthening the resilience of a system, which actually we've shown in the last few months is not very resilient at all. Once we've had a serious problem with one of the countries that supplies Europe with a lot of its energy.
Kempler, the Commission has obviously been extremely active in the 3.5 months since the invasion took place, and we've seen Ursula von der Leyen and Kadri Simpson, leading from the front on this issue. How satisfied are you with how quickly you are able to move, and how quickly national governments are coming along, sort of behind the Commission, if you like, or in front in some cases?
Yes, indeed. It's been a very busy period here in Brussels to bring forward our plans. But if we look at the plans, and also what Professor Watson just mentioned, I think the pillars are clear. Energy efficiency as something which we can do immediately, and that does not only include issues which we worked on before, like renovations, but also kind of energy savings through behavioral change. I mean, it's something which really can have an immediate effect. The diversification, as mentioned before, and of course, the ramp up of renewable energy. Now, I think the European Commission had a solid foundation, and that is something we shouldn't forget. I mean, if you look at the Fit for 55 package, which we presented in most of it in 2021, it already delivers essentially a reduction of about 130 BCMs of natural gas. So that was a solid foundation. And indeed, the voices which at that point in time said the European Commission is going too hard, well, those voices have clearly changed. And you see that also, I think, with the member states. The fact that at councils where the leaders of the EU come together, energy prices is constantly on the agenda, shows that there is really willingness to move here. And I think we have the opportunities. Previously, we coupled to the Fit for 55 plan this post-recovery program. 40% of all that funding needed to go and move towards climate mitigation. Now we're looking again how we can use residual funding, loans, etc., to speed that even up. So I think the momentum is definitely there. The pillars are in place. I think everyone supports that. Now, of course, one of the key elements is to speed up the whole legislative process, such that legislation is in place and actually the investors can really kind of put the money where it needs to be.
Thank you very much. Yes. Paolo, Franco, I'll turn to you now. A year ago, we were talking about the climate change, climate crisis, and the energy transition in that perspective. From that perspective, we're obviously now talking as much about energy security in a sort of similar context. And I wonder whether this is likely to be a more effective persuader for governments to move towards energy transition than the climate crisis.
I think, thank you for the question. I think it is possible indeed for some countries more than others. I would like to say that this is really the first truly global energy crisis in the world, with an amplitude which is comparable, if not even stronger than one of the 70s. Now, for some countries, there is no doubt that energy security is absolutely, for all countries, energy security is important, but for some, obviously, which are more exposed more than others. The energy security driver will be an incredibly, in my opinion, an incredible acceleration factor. The important thing is not to lose sight of the other crisis, which is the climate crisis, so that whatever we do is somehow consistent on what we need next. Now, of course, in some cases, we will need transitional measures, but it is important that they are consistent with the future. The other point which I would like to make is that all this needs to be policy driven. On one hand, it's very good that energy security accelerates and puts the attention to the policymakers, but we should not also underestimate some challenges. The supply chain challenges, monitoring critical minerals that are exported from Russia, inflation, higher interest rates. This is new territory for the renewable space and for any technology that has basically capex and low opex. This has important. So this will unavoidably lead to transitionally higher cost. And so policy focus is really more important than ever.
Professor Watson, I'd like to direct the same question to you. Our policy, Paolo Franco talks about policymakers and the need for policy. Are minds being focused more sharply by the energy security crisis and the cost crisis, of course, than they were by the climate transition? Is this we were very careful about how we talked about this very early on in the war, but is this an opportunity for the renewables industry, an opportunity to drive the energy transition using that different imperative?
Yeah, I thought the short answer is yes. I think the psychology of governments, particularly ministers I've known, is, when you talk to them about energy security, that's much more immediate. Crisis meetings, they may have to resign if they get it wrong, all those sorts of things. Unfortunately, against the opinion of many of us, climate just does not have that salience for them and that immediacy. It should, but it doesn't. And I think that means that this is accelerating in many cases the case for action. I think obviously, and I think this has been mentioned, in some cases there is then this grey area in the transition when countries are saying, like in the UK, well, perhaps we should also look at extracting more oil and gas. We've just licensed a new field in the UK last week. Coal plants being kept open in a number of European countries and elsewhere, etc. So, as I think Paolo was mentioning, it's how you manage that transition is really important. And that transition doesn't become a dominant part of the policy solution, where there will be then, again, a real tension between climate and security in the way there used to be. It's not necessary for that to happen, but there is a risk there.
Very much. I'm going to pivot the discussion a little bit now, and I turn to Carlos Nava. Your thousands of kilometers of pipeline and transmission focuses the mind on the infrastructure that is going to be required to have this transition to the liquid hydrogen that Gauri Singh was describing. If renewable energy deployment is the key to unlocking increased energy security for European nations, what needs to be done at a supranational and a national level to speed the adoption of renewables?
Well, thank you for the question. We believe in our case that one of the main things is probably something Paolo alluded to, and that's basically policy drivers. Once you get signals from policy that indeed you're going to have to get to a place where you're going to have to decarbonize heavily and quickly, that serves as a strong signal. That has to be accompanied not just in terms of objectives, but also with a number of tools that make that transition and the need to accelerate that transition something feasible and attainable. So for instance, these new targets that we have in the Repower EU packages or package are all kind of a welcome addition. They go in the right direction. It's a very comprehensive package in terms of the electrification, energy efficiency, increasing of clean hydrogen. It also needs to be accompanied by a number of measures that make it feasible for companies to do so. For instance, there's a directive, renewable energy directive, that is now has a draft delegated act, which states clearly some specific rules for how that actually comes into place. What is green hydrogen? What isn't green hydrogen? How that's done. In some cases, those put obstacles more so than actually ease the way for that transition to take place. So again, policy driver, I think to us might be one of the biggest things. Then of course there are other things like funding or financing programs that help pave the way and to speed up that transition, which for a lot of people it's going to be really, really difficult a path to take.
I'm very interested to understand, you're dealing with in the Commission 27 different national governments when you're trying to apply a policy framework and a targets framework. And we've already heard that some nations are going to move at different paces. They have different motivations. What is the level of alignment that you see between the European nations approaching this particular issue?
I think actually, well, 2 points. First of all, I think what Professor Watson just said, you have to make sure that it's, and also Paolo, what you have to make sure is that the transition or this energy independence, energy security aspect does not deteriorate away from your climate objectives. And this is, luckily, we can build on the Fit for 55 package. So any proposals that we've put forward already builds on the Fit for 55 package, which is the climate package. So that's where we try to ensure this coherency. Now, if we're talking specifically about renewable energy and energy efficiency, this is something all member states can do. Where previously, when we talked about energy policies, you have countries which have gas or countries which have other sources. Renewable energy sources are across all member states. Of course, there are differences. In the EU, we have countries which are landlocked, which don't have the opportunities for offshore wind, while others do. We have countries with large biomass resources which are not available for others. And I think that's where another element comes, which I think is really critically important, and that's the cooperation. So making this a European project is absolutely critical to make sure that we take advantage of all the different kind of aspects of the EU. And that is definitely also important in terms of renewable hydrogen, that topic which we have here on the agenda, because we have countries which have a lot of renewable resources. They can convert that resources, bring it to those countries which have heavy industry and big demand centralized, and then create this hydrogen infrastructure, which was already mentioned before, to enable this kind of much more regional approach to both climate and the energy security aspects.
Paolo, Franco, I'd like to come back to you. You were on our last panel event on green hydrogen a year or so ago, and during that discussion, we talked about it offering significant potential to speed the decarbonisation of shipping, manufacturing, heavy industry, but also a pathway to both production and demand requires significant investment in R&D, infrastructure, electrolyzer ramp up. And what can be done to accelerate this? So how you talked earlier about the policy environment as well, but what else is required?
There are bottlenecks and opportunities both on supply and demand. But to me, the priority now should be on demand. Because I go back to the slide of Gowrie. which has a very clear split of applications in the long term of hydrogen in industry versus transport versus buildings and other applications. But when it comes to the policy drivers right now, these objectives are less clear. So I think the priority is to have predictable demand, predictable markets. And to me, can be attained with a mixture of incentives, mandates, standards to define very clearly what is low carbon hydrogen, what is not. But in particular, the two first are crucial. For a while, the low carbon, the renewable based hydrogen will have a price premium. Who pays industry back for this price premium if they then have to compete in the world market on steel? I think this is a priority for many countries. It is a priority in particular for the European Union. So to me, the short-term, medium-term priority is to be on demand, have clear objectives and clear policy strategies to get there.
Thank you. Carlos Nava, you're at the sort of sharp end, if you like, of the need for infrastructure. In particular, how prepared are we for a sort of potential large-scale rollout of green hydrogen, and what, in your view, needs to take place in order to bring this to life?
I personally think that a lot of the technologies are pretty much ready to go. Clearly, there needs to be a scale up and a ramp up. So the scale factor in that equation is still kind of missing, but all the main elements in terms of technology blocks are present and at a pretty good development status, I would say. What needs to happen, I'm going to agree 100% with Paolo, demand is key. When we when we start up new projects, one of the main roadblocks that we find is trying to lock up demand. Primarily that has to do with let's say the targets that many of these companies face. Today, they're not very clear. And on top of which, once some of them are trying to be kind of trailblazers and actually be the first to implement these projects, then they find rules that are not very conducive to implementing those projects, which in turn is a roadblock for us to implement or to help them implement those projects producing hydrogen or investing into the infrastructure that they would need. Again, many of these objectives are good. We need to do a better job defining what is clean hydrogen, what is low carbon hydrogen, and particularly I would again point the finger to some of the latest rules that are coming out of the European Union. They're still in draft form that make it a little bit difficult for many of these projects to be implemented, and I'm afraid might actually be an obstacle for us to achieve the goals that we've set out in the REPowerEU and Fit for 55.
That actually brings me quite nicely to our next question. I'm going to ask all of the panelists this question, and it's how optimistic are you that national governments, regional bodies really have the ambition and commitment to overcome these challenges that stand in the way of a timely energy transition that we need to secure 2050 net zero target? I'll start with you, Professor Watson.
I'm usually pretty optimistic, but I'm now, a bit in the balance on this one. Not because I don't think the governments aren't committed, because I think they are committed at the high level. The strategies are there, the targets are there, all of that. I think where this may come unstuck is in implementation. And it's really, how do you pay for this? I mean, on aggregate, it's, as we all know, it's much cheaper to act on climate than it is not to, but the aggregate is not what people see, citizens see, especially at a time of a cost of living crisis. So I think, many countries still have a political problem to solve here, is how do you do this transition? You put in place all the policies that other panelists have mentioned, but then decide how you're going to distribute the costs of that and the benefits fairly and engage citizens in all walks of life and companies in the conversation about what that transition looks like. Again, that's in the rhetoric, but I think there's a lot of work to do politically to make that work. If they don't do that, my worry is that it will get derailed because of the political difficulties of implementing all of this.
Frankel, we do spend a lot of time in the industry talking about the obstacles in the way of the energy transition, and I would have you down as an optimist, I think, but so tell us where you stand on this question.
I'm half optimist, let's say, but more on the optimist side. I would say first, there's no doubt that the renewables have demonstrated to be by far the most resilient energy sources in this crisis. Already in COVID, and now more recently, we forecast 320 gigawatt of new capacities in 2022, an all-time record. And there is no doubt that renewables are often the cheapest option of any in many countries in the world. Now, having said so, two things. One, we are still not at the level enough for net zero. We should triple, quadruple these numbers by 2030. So a massive increase investment is needed in renewables, in all forms of renewables, in flexibility, in infrastructure, in electrolyzers. And the second is what I said before. Sometimes policymakers do not fully understand that the sector is under enormous profitability pressure. I mean, in order this to happen, the businesses that do the transition need to have a sustainable business with reasonable profits, and they cannot be squeezed in the middle by high inflation rate, high cost, supply changes, and then very tough, very tight and tough, ambitious targets. Targets are nice, but I think the next step for policy priority is to understand the financial health of the sector and make it really happen that this becomes a truly sustainable and progressively market-based business.
Thank you. I don't think you'll find anyone at Siemens Gamesa arguing with that proposition. Carlos Nava, I moved to Spain about 10 years ago, and at the time, I think it had the reputation for being a forward-thinking nation as far as renewable energy is concerned. But actually, in the sort of middle of the last decade, things sort of slowed up a little bit. So from that perspective of a country that was right in the vanguard to seeing a slowdown, how optimistic are you that nations can deliver on these commitments that they've made?
I think I would be fairly optimistic. I think we've made a lot of inroads in the last few years. Part of the, let's say, slowdown a few years ago had to do with the financial crisis and all the pain and suffering that carried. I think now we've changed things around, and we have a pretty ambitious, I would say, national energy and climate plan in terms of deploying renewables. And we understand that we are sort of at the forefront of Europe in that particular regard. So we see that this is possible. That said, a lot of that has to be implemented. And the issue here that I see is, ultimately, we're talking about long-term gain in exchange for short-term pain. And the pain is going to be borne by those probably at the lower rungs of society. You can think of all the people that will need to change or to suffer the change that we're talking about. These are systemic changes because it really touches on every aspect of every walk of life. You can think of truck drivers. These companies operate on very, very thin margins, profit margins. And if you tell them to electrify their operations overnight, they're going to face some unsurmountable cost premiums that they're just not going to be able to bear. They're going to have to fire people. Is that something we want to do? Is there a way to actually take that into consideration? How can we actually help that transition take place quickly? It's not an easy discussion to have. Politicians probably don't want to have it because that short-term pain is felt by them in the second term. First, the people in society are the ones who feel it, and then that gets transmitted up the chain of command to the politicians, who then have to face elections and angry people, riots on the streets, and whatever else. So that's one of the main issues that we have. But clearly now there is a level of commitment in terms of ramping up that change in a way that wasn't there before. Whether it's due to the Ukraine situation or other factors, I don't know, but certainly I'm fairly optimistic that this can actually happen, but more thought needs to be done, needs to go into how this is going to impact the, say, everyday Joe, so to speak.
Yeah, so finally, Ruud Kempner, the Commission is always ambitious, but is it optimistic as well?
Well, you can't be ambitious without optimism. And I think we've mentioned, or I think on social media, etc., we've highlighted this statistic a number of times, but I think it's really important, and that is that like 85% of the people, based on our analysis, are supporting more renewables to fight the energy security crisis which we have, the energy prices crisis which we have today. And I think as long as we have that, we can achieve these ambitions. And we see this also, and this is alluded to in the elections in the EU. More and more green parties are being elected into governments. We've seen complete shifts in some governments even. So that's a very important development. And with that, I think, yes, I see some of those growth pains. But again, there, I think if we can bring along the citizens, then we can be ambitious, because as soon as we kind of get renewables not only deployed a large scale, but local renewable energy communities can get engaged. If we get products where we can ask for a premium price because they're made for renewables and there is the demand, then those costs can be passed on through the supply chain, including the transport. And we already see that today. You know, big companies asking their supply chains to green. If you don't do it, you're not part of the supply chain. But of course, there is a premium, and I think that through this way can be passed on along the full energy system. And I want to take the advantage now, because Carlos mentioned a couple of times in terms of green hydrogen. Again, that is why we've put these definitions in place. We want renewable hydrogen to be made from renewable electricity. And only if we can make it from renewable electricity, we can avoid that we have negative impacts on the society. Because if you take away electricity from the grid, at the time where we have high electricity prices, at a time where a lot of industries are looking for decarbonized electricity, then we really will have negative impacts. And we have to make sure that renewable hydrogen comes with the renewable electricity, such that we can meet both the demand in the other energy sectors as well as that for hydrogen.
Yes, I agree. Thank you. So I've got some good questions come from the audience, and we'll turn to those now. And the first one comes from Niranjan, who asks, will higher commodity and raw material costs make the energy transition more difficult, at least in the short term? And I'd just like to link that then to something also that both Carlos and Paolo said, which is also we have a cost of living crisis here as well, and where people are really suffering. They see it in their bills. Are all these things making life more complicated for those trying to drive the energy transition and the pickup of green hydrogen? Paolo Franco, let me start with you on that one.
The IEA has been vocal from very early on the fact that the only response to both crises is the same, and it's accelerating the transition towards more energy efficiency, renewables, and any kind of low carbon technologies. Of course, you know that we are technology neutral, but it has to be low carbon. This is the response both for the short term and for the long term. Now, of course, the implementation of this transition and defending the weakest consumers will be the key. A couple of speakers mentioned that some sectors are more exposed than others. We have to protect them. It has to be a people-centered transition where we protect the consumers as much as possible, and we may need to use transitional methods for that. It may be difficult. It may make transition difficult. Let me give you an example. Just for policymakers, we have been spoiled with auctions where basically every time we were happy to report, oh, we have reached an even lower cost of solar or wind electricity. Okay, this is no longer enough. What is important is to have an affordable price for the consumers and a sustainable profit for the industry. This needs to be the next priority.
Who asked, when would we expect to produce hydrogen cheaply enough to become a cost-effective and easily accessible source of energy for transportation to replace fossil fuel as an instant source of energy? I'm not sure who'd like to, maybe someone put their hand up and answer for that question. What sort of timescale can we place on affordable green hydrogen? Carlos.
So I can take a crack at this one. It really depends. It depends to some degree on the rules that I alluded to, that Ruud actually mentioned, that that they're trying to set a definition for green hydrogen. And I say this for one particular reason. Those rules and the way they're implemented really have a major impact in terms of the final price of hydrogen. So I think there is a way in which we can ensure that the hydrogen can be a source from renewable electricity in a way that is consistent with the definition of green electricity and, of course, the having a positive climate impact, and at the same time making sure that that hydrogen is produced at the lowest possible cost. If that's the case, we believe that you can actually find good business cases in the short term. Even today, in certain cases, you can probably already see it. And in the next 5 to 10 years, you should start seeing a bit of a ramp up. If those rules, for instance, stay as they are today, the price of hydrogen in our simulations basically doubles as it is today. And that will make it a business case that is not going to be approved by any board of administrators, at least not in my company and most of the companies that we talk to. So that timeline basically is along those lines, I would say.
Interesting question here that actually is not asked as often as I expect it to be. This is from Anami, and who asks, is it conceivable to replace all fossil fuels currently used in the world by renewable energy and green hydrogen or other forms of hydrogen? Who'd like to have a stab at that one? Paolo Franco, maybe? Yeah.
In our net zero emission to 2050 roadmap, we are almost there. We are sometimes going by heart now. We are at level around 70% from renewables, and the rest is nuclear energy in the power sector. And then there is some remaining fossil fuels plus carbon capture, use and storage. Please remember that the problem are not the fossil fuels, but the emissions. So indeed, there is a role, and it is visible also in IRENA scenarios for carbon capture use. I would also remind that we need carbon for chemicals and products and materials, and for permanent storage where this is possible, either with really carbon direct removal regimes. So it is maybe not 100%, but we get very close in our scenarios by 2050.
I have a question I think that perhaps Professor Watson might like to answer. This is from Ron Randall. Can governments capture a fraction of the eventual reduction in fossil fuel prices as taxes to support energy transition to renewables? Say a transition tax on fossil fuels equal to, say, 30% of $100 barrel market price of Brent crude. This is obviously a debate that's going on in some governments at the moment about so-called, the windfall taxes. But is there a mechanism for making fossil pay for the transition?
The short answer is yes, and some countries have done it not just in terms of the windfall tax that the UK government is now introducing, for example. So say Norway has a long-standing way of managing its oil and gas wealth and put it into a wealth fund. I mean, obviously not all that wealth fund goes into low carbon energy, but it could. So, there is a way of making sure that the revenue you get at times of high prices can then be used to invest in alternatives, which is exactly what economic theory suggests you should do with a finite resource in the first place. It's just most governments have never done it. With the windfall tax, I mean, again, it's a bit shorter term, but you can do that. I think the problem with the UK proposal on the table at the moment is that the tax breaks that are being given for investment is only in oil and gas and not in renewable energy or other forms of low carbon energy, which clearly ought to be the case. So, you can do it, but it really depends how.
Excellent, thank you. Now, I have a question. We've talked a lot about demand and stimulating demand in the discussion so far. We have a question from Joseph about supply. As the discussion clearly points out, demand for green hydrogen needs to ramp up to ensure there is consistent revenue streams. What about supply constraints? Are there enough resources being dedicated to ramp up supply? If so, could you mention a few? Are there enough resources? Who'd like to take that? Carlos, perhaps?
I'll take a crack at it. I would say that is indeed the case. I think you, in principle, have enough resources today that can answer the call for more supply. I'll give you one example. There are plenty of companies that make large-scale electrolyzers who are announcing or on the verge of announcing that they are increasing or ramping up production with large automated factories at they're calling gigafactories basically, or factories with a production capacity in the gigawatts worth of electrolysis. Most of the time, however, the lines that are part of those factories are running at let's say a fraction of their capacity, simply because the demand is not quite there yet. There may be some specific spots in the supply chain that once that demand starts seeing the light of day, might get strained. But so far, what we see is that the supply chain market, for lack of a better term, looks to be pretty ready to answer the call, I would say.
I think we've probably got time just for one more question from the audience. And again, I like this one. All political mechanisms to change the present take a long time we no longer have. We need to convince the smoker to become a non-smoker today. Companies and governments must take an exceptional pathway to become successful with this mission and duty. What mechanisms do you think can be effective and efficient convincing the consumer today of the need to move to this transition? And I open that to whoever would like to answer. Just jump in. Don't all jump in at once. Professor Watson, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I was taken by the last bit of the question, convince the consumer. I mean, in the end, I think, you know, policies that depend on telling the consumer or the citizen, as I prefer to refer to them, to do things differently, whether it's insulate your house or buy a different car, are all very well. But I think, as many other panelists and speakers have emphasised, that, you know, these energy systems are systems and they sit in structures, and many people can't afford to suddenly change and, you know, do their bit for net zero. And need help. They need the options on the table, you know, access to, I don't know, a cheap heat pump they can buy, or an easy way of upgrading their home, or much cheaper electric vehicles because they're still incredibly expensive. So yeah, I think there are things we can do quickly, but I'm very nervous of an approach which says, you know, just telling people that they must do more quickly without saying, here are the means to help you, here is the infrastructure investment to enable that to happen and to make it cost effective and easy for you.
And it's a case of stimulating citizens to demand more of their governments rather than the other way around. Yeah.
I think one of the things which I do see in the approach which we're taking here at the European Commission is that it's not about one specific policy. And that's where this idea of packages comes in. So it's not only about convincing the citizen, but it's working on renewable energy, it's working on energy efficiency, it's working on carbon pricing as one issue, it's working on different energy taxations, so such that indeed electricity or renewable hydrogen is not as taxed as high as the others, and it's working on infrastructure all at the same time. And therefore, I think really having these policies, not like one specific policy, but tackling kind of climate change, but also the energy security crisis across the different kind of policy instruments is the only way to indeed change and transition that whole energy system.
Thank you very much. Carlos, go ahead.
Just one thing to add to what Ruth just said. I couldn't agree more with what he just said in terms of having packages that kind of try to be comprehensive in nature and try to reach broad swaths of society. To implement the change. Most people at individual levels, they take a while to change their day-to-day lives, for sure. I think at the policy level, we can certainly do a lot. The only thing that I would ask is that once this picture of large parts of the final energy demand eventually coming from renewable energy, as Paulo was saying a while ago, basically realize that renewable energy sources are the kind of a supply, which then have to be channeled to the final uses, either through electricity, electrons, green electrons, or as green hydrogen, or perhaps other ways that we haven't actually developed yet. And both of them need to be looked at as complementary to each other in time, scope, and policy help, if I can put it that way, so that we can all achieve this goal as quickly as possible and as comprehensively as possible in a way that is also economically effective, so that people don't start losing jobs and we can still carry on.
Thank you, Paolo. Franco, if you to bring
10 seconds. If there is a positive aspect of the COVID crisis, is that if the crisis is huge, humans have demonstrated that they can react incredibly quickly. Nobody would have thought to produce billions of vaccines, right? Without which the cost would have been much, much higher. Second, the crucial point, I repeat, is that the transition is people-centered, which means we do not look just at the profit of the few, but we look at the socio-economic benefits in terms of jobs, in terms of community involvement, in terms of seeing the opportunity side. If policymakers can that, I'm optimistic.
Thank you you very much. We have enough questions actually to keep going for a good long time yet, but we don't have the time to do it. So I'd like to thank all of those who asked questions, and I'd particularly like to thank the panel for their answers and a very stimulating discussion. Now I will turn the meeting over to Juan Gutierrez to bring proceedings to a close with your speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. And I have to say, I wanted to jump in a lot of the questions, and I want to actually emphasize a couple. One is the need for a healthy industry. I think Paolo mentioned it. You know, it's very important that we have a healthy business and a whole value chain that we can continue to reinvest, that we can continue to bring technology and industrialize. And I think we talk a lot about the price premium, and I think the right conversation should be the value of hydrogen and the value that it brings of being local, of being green, and of being stable. And if we value it that way, I think the conversation will not be about the price premium, but it will be priced at the right level. So I want to thank everybody. I think it's very clear. It demonstrates how important and crucial it is, you know, both renewable energy and green hydrogen to really deliver on this dual challenge we have. We have a dual challenge of meeting the 2050 targets and also at the same time being independent, energy independent. It is clear, even before the Russia invasion, we were talking about policies, talking about the need to accelerate deployment of renewable energy. And now, when we know that 40% of the gas is coming from Russia, that almost 30% of the oil is coming from Russia, I think is more clear than ever. So for me, it's very clear that unless the European nations become energy independent, we will have these two big threats. First of all, we will fail the 2050 net zero target. And for me, it's more than the target, it's about the impact that a catastrophe of climate change will bring. The impact that it will bring to societies, to communities, and to the millions of people that are in this world. And the second challenge is, how do we ensure energy security? And it means, how do we avoid that we depend on one country that could be stable, or that we have this volatility on the prices and instability on the supply? So for me, it comes to, you know, time is not on our side at this point. I think it's urgent. I think we cannot wait to have a normal organic growth of renewable energy or of green hydrogen. It may look a gloomy scenario now, but solution. We do have the technologies. I think Carlos mentioned it. We do have the, you know, we have the means, and we can invest more and we can grow if we can get to that stable demand. But we can only do this together. It's very clear that we need to work together on the private sector, on the public sector, and we really need to focus on how do we work with the state and the local authorities to maximize the volume of renewable energy. When you look at the numbers, the challenge is very clear. In 2021, Europe installed 11 gigawatts, and we were supposed to build 32 gigawatts if we want to keep track of our targets. 32 gigawatts. Now you take the REPower EU target, we want to be at 530 gigawatts by 2030. That means we need to be at 40 gigawatts, 40 gigawatts, on a year that we've installed only a fourth of it. So we have a long way to go. It cannot be that we wait again for incremental changes or consumer behavior. We really need to lead the change now. And for Siemens Gamesa, is very clear what is the path to get there, to really help Europe to get back on track. And I can summarize it in 5 points. First of all, speed up of permitting. This is clear that we have enough capacity in wind. We really need to speed up the permitting. We could start, we will be very happy to supply many, many turbines to Europe, and I think the capacity is there. Second is about the energy and the hydrogen infrastructure. And I was very happy to hear Carlos and the projects that you're working on. We need to be able to move the hydrogen, we need to be able to store it and distribute it. So a lot of investments have to be done here. Third, we need to look more at storage. If we want to have a guarantee supply, and we want to be able to store hydrogen enough to have this stable supply to satisfy the demand, we need to do a lot more innovation on storage and be able to deploy this in an industrialized way. Fourth point, like I said before, and I think the whole panel agrees, is the legislative and the regulatory framework. We need to create that stability. We need to be able to have this cost competitive supply of green hydrogen, and that will only comes with the help of the regulation. Finally, it is a problem that we all have. So we need to work across industry, a full collaboration to be able to scale up. The technology is there, but I have to say we also need to mature the technology, especially on the electrolyzer side. but we have the capabilities and we have the solutions there. So I am very optimistic, Ben. You didn't ask me, but I am very optimistic of the future. I think we know what the problem is, and I think we know what the solution is. So with that, I just want to thank all the panelists. I really appreciate the discussion. I also want to thank everybody that participated. And for those that have not downloaded the paper of Unlocking European Energy Security, please go to our website and download it. And I look forward to continue the discussion and most importantly, working together to really build a more sustainable world. Thank you. Ben, we cannot hear you.
I basically said thank you and goodbye. And thank you to the speakers and those who participated. We bring it to a close.